The first time I stepped into my daughter-in-law's family home, I carried nothing but the illusion of simplicity. I wore an old, worn-out jacket that smelled faintly of the rain from my walk, and my shoes had scuffed soles that whispered of years gone by. I told myself it was just an act. I had to appear humble, even naive. But deep down, my chest felt heavy, burdened with more than just the weight of my coat. My son had married into a family of wealth and influence, people whose smiles were polite but whose eyes seemed to measure every flaw, every imperfection, as if assessing whether I belonged in their world. I wanted to be invisible, yet painfully, I could feel every gaze piercing through me. From the moment we arrived, the subtle jabs began. A slight tilt of the head, a raised eyebrow, or a faint laugh that didn't quite reach the eyes. My daughter-in-law's brother asked about my profession, and when I stammered, "I work in construction, sometimes odd jobs," a hush seemed to fall across the room. I caught my son's nervous glance, as if urging me to play the part convincingly, but the embarrassment settled deep, squeezing my heart. I felt the cold press of judgment, the kind that comes when you are an outsider in a world that measures people not by character, but by wealth, education, and pedigree. My attempts to join their conversation were met with condescending smiles. I laughed at jokes I barely understood, nodded at stories I could hardly follow, and pretended admiration where there was none. Every compliment I tried to offer was met with a polite brush-off or a faint smirk. Even my attempts to sit comfortably were interrupted by the faint shifting of their designer chairs, as if my presence alone was an intrusion into their carefully curated lives. By the time dinner was served, I felt the weight of humiliation pressing me into my chair. The food was exquisite, but the conversation stung more than any bitter taste. Questions about finances, career ambitions, and accomplishments cut sharper than any knife. My hands trembled slightly as I poured myself some water, aware that their eyes were watching me struggle with the simplest of tasks. I felt the sting of inadequacy, a pain that was not physical but far deeper, a gnawing, relentless reminder that I was seen as less than, a man who could never truly belong here. And yet, beneath the surface of my embarrassment, something else began to stir. A quiet fire, small but persistent, flickered in my chest. I knew I had to endure this, to absorb the shame without letting it crush me entirely. If I could play the part of the poor, naive father convincingly, there would come a day when the scales of judgment would tip, and those who now looked down on me would learn the depth of their own misjudgment. But at that moment, seated among the polished silver and crystal glasses, the laughter that was not meant for me, and the invisible walls that separated us, the pain was absolute, suffocating, and inescapable. I realized that humility could be my disguise, but humiliation was my teacher, and it was only the beginning. As the evening unfolded, the subtle judgments shifted into outright mockery. My attempts to converse were met with laughter that lingered too long, the kind that pricked the skin and made every word I spoke feel wrong. My son's in-laws, who had greeted me with faint politeness at first, now seemed to delight in highlighting my supposed ignorance. When I mentioned that I sometimes repaired things around the neighborhood for extra income, my daughter-in-law's cousin let out a sharp, exaggerated laugh. "Oh, so you fix things for pennies," he sneered, leaning back in his chair as if my existence alone was a spectacle. Others joined in with gentle chuckles that carried the bite of disdain. I smiled through it, careful not to reveal the swell of hurt rising in my chest. My pride, already bruised, felt like it was being shredded piece by piece in front of the people who mattered most to my son. The most humiliating moment came when they began discussing vacations, exotic trips, and investments. I tried to contribute by mentioning a small road trip I had taken with my son last year. Before I could finish, someone interrupted. "Oh, that's cute, really modest, isn't it?" The emphasis on the word modest made it sound like a charity case. I nodded politely, feeling my face burn as a wave of shame swept over me. My son's forced smile did little to mask his discomfort, and I knew he felt caught between defending me and appeasing his family. Even the smallest gestures became opportunities for ridicule. When I reached for a dish, one of them whispered, loud enough for me to hear, "Better make sure he doesn't spill it everywhere." Laughter followed, and I froze, feeling every eye on me as if I were a child fumbling with responsibilities far beyond my reach. My fingers, which had handled heavy tools and machinery all my life, now felt clumsy and weak. I wondered, not for the first time that evening, whether the world had always been this cruel, or if it was only cruel to those it underestimated. By the end of dinner, the room had grown louder with amusement at my expense. Even my daughter-in-law, who had married me into the family, seemed caught in the awkward tension, glancing at me with a mix of sympathy and unease. It was a public display of my supposed inferiority, a performance where every laugh and every sideways glance was aimed at reminding me of my place. And yet I remained seated, silent and composed, letting the humiliation wash over me while carefully masking the storm that brewed inside. Beneath the laughter, beneath the whispers and smirks, a resolve was forming. The pain was no longer just personal, it was public. The world, or at least this room, had judged me and found me lacking. But every sneer, every condescending comment only strengthened my determination. I would not react now. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. This was a calculated stage, and the humiliation was part of the play. One day they would see the truth behind the disguise, and the echoes of their laughter would turn into a sound far more bitter: regret. After the dinner ended and the guests began to leave, a heavy silence settled over the room. It wasn't the calm of peace. It was the kind of silence that presses down on you, reminding you of every word that had been said, every laugh that had cut through your pride. My son tried to engage in light conversation as we helped clear the table, but the shadow of the evening lingered. Even my daughter-in-law, normally warm and attentive, seemed unsure of how to bridge the distance between me and her family. I retreated into myself, letting the quiet stretch like a rope around my shoulders. My mind replayed each moment of the night, the laughter that wasn't meant for me, the whispered comments that stung more than shouts could, the way their eyes had scanned me, measuring, judging and finding me wanting. I could feel the anger simmering beneath the surface, but I kept it locked away, buried beneath a mask of calm and restraint. Responding in the moment would have satisfied them. Reacting impulsively would have fed the story they wanted to tell about me. The silence wasn't just external, it echoed within me. I realized that in this stillness I had an opportunity, a chance to observe, to understand, and to plan. Every word they had said, every sneer, every subtle jab had been recorded in my memory. I could feel the strategy forming, a slow and deliberate path that would eventually shift the balance of power. The humiliation and judgment were temporary. My response, carefully measured and executed, would last far longer. I watched my son's expression as he tried to navigate the uncomfortable mood. His unease mirrored mine in ways I hadn't expected, but I also saw trust in his eyes. He had always known me as a man capable of handling adversity, and now, even in this uncomfortable setting, he seemed to believe that I had a plan, though he didn't know what it was yet. That quiet confidence, even when unspoken, became a source of strength. By the time the house emptied and the last car drove away, the silence had transformed into a companion rather than a burden. It allowed me to reflect on the disparity between appearance and reality, wealth and worth, perception and truth. I realized that true power lay not in shouting or proving oneself in public, but in the quiet accumulation of knowledge, patience, and control. The evening had been painful, yes, but it had also given me insight, a blueprint of arrogance and condescension that I could use to my advantage. I sat alone in the living room, the echoes of laughter now distant, replaced by the rhythm of my own breathing. I understood with absolute clarity that silence was a weapon just as potent as ridicule or aggression. It allowed the mind to observe without interruption, to prepare without exposure. And in that stillness, I promised myself that the next time we met, the balance would shift. The power I lacked tonight would not be gone forever. The silent storm was gathering, and when it struck, It would be undeniable, irrevocable, and just. The next few weeks passed quietly, but the air around me had changed. I had returned to my usual routines, work, errands, small social visits, but every action was now guided by a deliberate purpose. The humiliation from that night had planted a seed, and I nurtured it with patience, observation, and careful planning. I studied their habits, their pride, their need to be seen as superior, and I began to understand exactly how to tilt the scales in my favor. It started subtly. I offered help to their neighbors and contacts under the guise of my odd jobs, showing competence and reliability that slowly began to contradict the image of the naive, poor man they had constructed. Word traveled, as it always does, and small whispers of admiration began circulating in the circles that mattered to them. Meanwhile, I maintained my humble demeanor whenever I met my daughter-in-law's family, never revealing the network of influence and respect I had quietly been building. Every smile and polite nod became a calculated part of a performance that concealed a growing strength. The turning point came when my son mentioned an upcoming family event, a charity auction where status, wealth, and connections would be on display. I volunteered to assist in organizing it, presenting myself as the unassuming father eager to help in whatever small way I could. They accepted without hesitation, expecting little, unaware that the man they had ridiculed possessed a network of professionals, suppliers, and patrons that would soon become indispensable to the event's success. On the day of the auction, I arrived early, coordinating logistics, troubleshooting problems, and quietly ensuring that every detail ran smoothly. Their family, used to relying on wealth alone, found themselves turning to me for solutions, guidance, and reassurance. The irony was intoxicating. Those who had mocked my supposed incompetence were now dependent on my expertise. The room that once echoed with ridicule now acknowledged my presence, not with laughter, but with reluctant respect. I observed the subtle shifts in behavior. A cousin who had sneered at my pennies complimented the way I handled a logistical hiccup. My daughter-in-law's brother, who had interrupted me during dinner weeks ago, now asked for advice on coordinating a large donation. The power dynamic had begun to invert, almost imperceptibly at first, but undeniably. Where I had once been invisible and humiliated, I was now seen as capable, essential, and quietly authoritative. By the end of the evening, the transformation was complete. The family that had once measured me by outward appearances and wealth now confronted the reality that they had underestimated me. The naive, poor father they had mocked had become a pivotal figure in an event that showcased their own status and influence. The balance of power had shifted, and I could feel it in the way they listened, the way they deferred, the way their eyes no longer carried judgment but calculation. The fire that had begun in pain and humiliation now burned with the quiet heat of triumph, preparing the stage for the shock that was soon to follow. The following month, I orchestrated what would be the most unforgettable family gathering they had ever attended. It was subtle at first, a casual invitation to a small dinner at my home. They expected the same humble, naive father they had once mocked, ready for easy jokes and polite smiles. But I had prepared meticulously. Every detail, every arrangement, every small decision was designed to reveal the truth of my capabilities and to deliver a shock they would not forget. When they arrived, I greeted them warmly just as I had before, but this time the house was immaculate, the table set with a sophistication they hadn't anticipated from a man they deemed poor. Their eyes widened slightly, curiosity replacing their usual amusement. I noticed it, of course, and allowed a small, knowing smile to linger as I guided them through the evening. Conversations flowed, but this time, I subtly guided topics to areas where I held influence, where my network and knowledge became immediately apparent. Each time they asked for advice, I offered solutions with ease, turning moments of casual inquiry into demonstrations of competence. Then came the subtle reveals. I had arranged for a few mutual acquaintances, people of influence and reputation, to drop by unexpectedly. They casually praised my achievements, mentioning projects I had completed, funds I had raised, and connections I had nurtured. The family's expressions shifted from curiosity to disbelief. The same cousins and relatives who had once laughed at me now listened, awestruck, as my true capacity and influence were displayed. Their polite smiles faded, replaced by silent recognition that they had misjudged me entirely. The final, most devastating moment arrived when I handed my son's father-in-law a small envelope, claiming it contained some paperwork for his business venture. Inside, however, were documents proving my ownership of several properties, investments, and partnerships that directly impacted his interests. The shock was immediate. His confident, condescending demeanor crumbled, replaced by stunned silence. Others exchanged glances, murmurs rising in disbelief. The man who had mocked my income, my education, and my presence now confronted undeniable evidence that I wielded far more influence than he had ever imagined. My daughter-in-law's family struggled to find words. The roles had reversed completely. The mockery had vanished, replaced by respect, caution, and a new, hesitant awareness of my power. They had treated me as weak, poor, and naive, and now they were forced to reckon with the truth. They had been wrong in every assumption. The shock was not just in the reveal of my assets or connections, but in the realization that they had underestimated me entirely. Every laugh at dinner, every condescending glance, had been paid back with a measured, unyielding demonstration of capability. As the evening concluded, I watched the family leave, their steps slower, their whispers quieter, their glances more thoughtful. The revenge had been served not through anger or confrontation, but through the quiet, inescapable truth of who I was. They had mocked, humiliated, and judged me, but the outcome now spoke louder than any insult ever could. The shock was complete and the satisfaction profound. For the first time, the balance of power was unmistakably mine, and they could only confront it silently, unable to undo the lesson they had just learned. The days that followed, the change in my daughter-in-law's family was undeniable. Where once there had been smirks, whispers, and subtle condescension, there was now cautious respect, careful words, and an awareness that every interaction carried weight. It wasn't forced, it was genuine. They had witnessed firsthand the discrepancy between perception and reality, and in that recognition, a moral reckoning had taken place. The laughter that had once cut through me was now replaced by a quiet acknowledgement of fairness, of balance restored. I continued my interactions with them, but with a subtle authority that could not be ignored. When they sought advice, I provided it willingly, but now they listened with intent, weighing my words. Decisions that once would have been theirs to control exclusively now included my input, my perspective valued rather than dismissed. The very family who had publicly humiliated me had learned, without a single harsh confrontation, that respect was earned not through wealth or status alone, but through integrity, patience, and intelligence. The moral justice of the situation lay not in revenge for its own sake, but in the awakening I had orchestrated. I had endured humiliation, pain, and silence, not as a victim, but as a student of human nature. I had allowed the family to reveal their arrogance and prejudice fully, and in doing so, I created the opportunity for a natural correction. They had judged me on appearances, laughed at my simplicity, and ignored my worth. But the truth had emerged in its own undeniable way, forcing them to reconcile their assumptions with reality. Even my son observed the shift with quiet pride. He had known me for years, had witnessed my humility and capability, and now saw the world recognizing the same truth. My daughter-in-law, once embarrassed by her family's behavior, could finally see the balance restored, the dignity I had always carried quietly now acknowledged by all. And in that, there was satisfaction that went beyond personal triumph. It was justice in its most elegant form, earned, not demanded, observed rather than declared. Over time, the interactions smoothed into a new normal. The family treated me with respect but never fear. They acknowledged my wisdom without resentment. Every sarcastic comment, every laugh at my expense was replaced by thoughtful consideration. The lesson was absorbed. The world may attempt to humiliate, to judge, to diminish, but true character, patience, and intelligence cannot be ignored indefinitely. Justice, when earned through composure and strategy, is far more powerful than any impulsive retaliation. Sitting quietly one evening, reflecting on the journey, I realized that the initial pain, the public humiliation, the silence, and the eventual power shift had all been necessary steps toward this resolution. Life had a way of teaching lessons, and sometimes those lessons are most impactful when they come wrapped in patience, observation, and subtle strategy. The family had learned, as had I, that true worth is revealed not by first impressions or superficial judgments, but by enduring integrity, careful planning, and the courage to remain steadfast in the face of mockery. In the end, moral justice had been served, not with anger or malice but with undeniable truth, and that was the sweetest triumph of all.